Hello and welcome to J&B Talk F1. I'm Jawad Yaqub as always, and I'm joined by Baden Westerweller. How are you today?
I'm very good, thank you. I'm glad to be back again. How are you, Jawad?
I'm very well, thanks, and we'll get straight into it then. On this edition, we'll be talking all things British Grand Prix with the event coming up this weekend, as well as having a wrap at the recent in-season test in Austria from last week. We'll also be taking a look at some of the headlines that have been in circulation as well in the past week. Is F1 for sale, being sold to Qatar investors and also American investors? Jean Todt about F1 having a headache, not a cancer, and also a look at Mark Webber's Australian story, which aired on the ABC network the previous night. But first of all, British Grand Prix, Baden, one of the big races of the year.
Oh, absolutely. This is up there with obviously Monaco, Monza, Belgium, the season finale. This really, when you go back through in the absence of the French Grand Prix now, Britain's really the home of motorsport, and it's a big moment in the juncture of this season. We've got Nico Rosberg, who's obviously taken the fight up to Lewis Hamilton in recent events. So it's a big moment for Lewis really to reassert his authority. He's on home territory here, and having won last season, I think he'll be really keen to make sure that he puts on a good show in front of the home crowd. But beyond that, we've also got Kimi Räikkönen again. He's under pressure to perform. There's a lot of people calling for him to be shuffled aside, and also as well Force India, the long-awaited the E-Spec car, as they call it. It's been touted for now a couple of months, and they've finally got it ready to go, and they're quite confident, or bullish, as I like to say, about the prospect of perhaps beating Red Bull to that fourth position in the constructors' standings.
Yeah, on Force India, we assumed that the car would debut at the Austrian Grand Prix, but in fact they debuted it at the testing that occurred right after the Grand Prix. But good for Force India. They can get back into the points regularly, having lost out on those points at the start of the season. But going back to Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg, Rosberg obviously won the previous race in Austria. He got some extra miles under his belt at the test as well. Should Lewis be worried at his home event, or will we see Lewis reassert himself over Rosberg?
Well, I think when you do look through it, obviously Nico's wisely taken up the extra day, the extra seat mileage. It can't hurt him, that's for sure. But we have seen, obviously, with Lewis from practice at Austria, he had a pretty poor first day there, and he still came out and ended up on pole. He doesn't happen as well at Malaysia. Of course, he had those technical woes, and he still came out and was really the leading man there. So I don't think it'll be too huge of a concern. Nevertheless, I think Rosberg, the way that the tide has been going recent events, he's very much on his game, and he'll be looking to continue it. So the home crowd support factor, it's always going to be there, but ultimately, who knows until we get there. Obviously, Lewis has got that raw pace, which always seems to come to the fore now on Saturdays, unlike last season when it was Rosberg who seemed to have the edge there. But Sundays are another question, particularly since Barcelona. Hamilton's had his fair share of dodgy starts, and this is where Nico's been able to capitalise on that and really go on with it and take the victories.
Indeed, and we're still yet to see both guys battle wheel to wheel, as it were, on track. So hopefully the British crowd can be in for something, and the British motorsport fans have been spoilt really over the past fortnight with motorsport, obviously with the Formula E making its debut at the Battersea Park Street Circuit, that finale being wrapped up by ex-F1 driver Nelson Piquet Jr., and of course the legendary Goodwood Festival of Speed.
Very envious of you there, Jawad. I had my reasons for missing out on the live streaming of that. I heard about Valentino making the mad dash from Aston, where he's had his spectacular triumph there on Saturday and got behind the wheel of nothing less than the 91 Le Mans winner, the Mazda, that was piloted by Johnny Herbert.
Indeed, yeah. It was pretty good to... obviously the best thing to do would be to be there and witness it all, but nevertheless, Goodwood put on a good show, even for viewers at home across the world. And interesting thing regarding Valentino Rossi there is apparently his desire to drive the 91 Mazda 787B came from playing driving it in a PlayStation or Xbox game. They didn't specify what it was, but yeah, he played it in a video game, and there you go, Struth. He wants to drive it in real life.
And any chance, Joe, out of an impersonation of the great man in those exact words, perhaps with the trademark Valentino inflection?
I play many years on the PlayStation, the Mazda, and I like it very much. And yeah, it was very good, very good. I'm very
That is
happy to be here
most
today.
beautiful, most beautiful.
It is the most beautiful, yes, Bella.
Very good. 10 out of 10 to you there, Jord.
I'm sorry if some of you guys don't enjoy the impersonations, but yeah, we're gonna try our best. But anyway, going back to Silverstone, you mentioned Kimi there before as well, and again, a lot of calls over the week, let's say, about Kimi's future and whether he should stay in F1 or not. David Coulthard came out with some interesting views as well. Can you enlighten us on that, please?
Oh, absolutely. David Coulthard, obviously, he was, in fact, Kimi Raikkonen's teammate for several seasons there, 2002 to 2004 at McLaren, before he was moved on. He's come out and essentially just said it's time for a bit of a revolution at Ferrari, get another younger driver in there. He doesn't necessarily say that he's against Kimi. He just reckons that having been there in the past, when he was obviously at Red Bull in 08, he was ushered aside for Sebastian Vettel. We all saw what he went on to achieve in a very short time space beyond his 2009 debut there, but he essentially just said that he speaks from experience. He doesn't want to see someone like Kimi, who is a world champion, end up leaving the sport with his tail between his legs, having achieved so much, and he's got that reputation there. He's of the opinion that he's probably better off being shuffled aside sooner than later, and with the rider, unless he turns it around in the next 5 or 6 races with several victories. But I don't know. It's a tough call. That came out a few weeks ago, and I am a big fan of Kimi personally, but he has to get his act together sooner than later. The next 3 events, but 2 events as it is now without Germany prior to this mid-season break, and then indeed at Belgium, where he has been known to shine previously, that they could be the making of his 2016 status.
Yeah, obviously, there's no secret that Ferrari have made it clear that performance will indeed go into deciding whether Kimi will stay on as well, and we've discussed this at length in previous podcasts as well about Kimi, and I remember we shared your piece as well regarding Kimi's future and whatnot. So it's just a matter of seeing, what happens over the next few events, whether Kimi can, pick up some podiums or even, get that win that, Sebastian Vettel managed so early on in the season. But yeah, regarding Silverstone in general, we'll be back Sunday before the race to preview the race with you at length. But for now, let's move on, and F1 is for sale. Perhaps, potentially. Yes.
Yeah, we've had many rumours, obviously, but these ones seem to be a lot more concentrated than the usual, as you would say, the trash topics which come out when there's little else circulating in the headlines. We've got quite a few, actually, reports that have come through in the past fortnight, not least this one, Stephen Ross, who is a manager of the NFL's Miami Dolphins in conjunction with RSC Ventures. There's this report that they're looking at a 35% stake in Formula One acquired from the current holders CVC partners. And beyond that, what do you have to say, Jawad, about this one specifically?
Yeah, in conjunction with the Stephen Ross and RSC, also Qatar as well. In general, they want to buy a piece into F1 as well. There's obviously been word that Qatar want to hold their own events in a couple of years' time as well. So them taking over, the sport in general would obviously give them that. But it's quite interesting that, they want to at a time where a lot of people are complaining about, costs and whatnot. Formula One is too expensive. Someone is coming to the table and saying, hang on, I'm going to buy it all. So,
Oh, it shows you F1, despite what the outward persona might be, that it's still extremely lucrative to these cashed-up conglomerates, whatever you want to call them. They've got the backing of multiple nations, essentially. They're willing to throw the kitchen sink at a bid to wrest the control. Because really, when you look at Formula One, just having that power, it really is, on a global stage, a massive player there, and they'll be willing to go to whichever lengths is necessary.
Indeed, but when we sit and talk about all this sort of stuff, it sounds more like, we're talking about, a corporation or business rather than a sporting enterprise,
Oh, that's the way that I think a lot of sports these days do seem to have that more business than sport approach, as F1 has been described as numerous times in the past couple of years. But indeed, this whole business franchise aspect has come to the fore over what is seen as the overriding sport front, as would be the case with the FIA having the autonomy and the control, which we'll allude to a bit later on with the Jean Todt there.
Yeah, exactly. The thing is, would a change of power, change of control of power, actually foresee some kind of change in the sport? Will these areas that need to be addressed quickly, will that happen? We don't know. Perhaps selling to someone else could mean things go for worse.
Well, it would be nice if these potential new investors have altruistic purposes for getting involved in Formula One, that they might be racers at heart themselves, but it's very naive to take that view into these discussions and whatever the outcome might be until further notice. They're another big corporation. They're looking to make massive money and without any real concern for the long-term prospects of F1.
Yeah, that's exactly my point. Wouldn't you rather someone be in control of the sport who has a genuine concern for the sport's future and well-being in terms of still being a sport, a competition?
Yeah, it's a very fine line these days what their intentions really are. It's something that probably has to be addressed. We have seen these talks in past months about the EU wanting to get involved potentially in this relation with the whole structure of costs and whatnot. That sort of vaguely ties into the entire ownership structure of F1. And indeed, we have got a couple of other interested parties there, not least John Malone, who has put his hand up in recent seasons through his Liberty Media company. He's talking about something around the 49% stake. So whether
that's a pretty significant chunk. With the Qatar and RSC ventures only want a 35.5% cut from CVC, so 49%. That's almost it's very close to the majority figure, you have to say.
Well, it's as close as you'd want to get, I guess, without having that perception that you are coming in to just take over control and do whatever they wish to do with it when they've got that kind of power at their disposal.
Indeed. But yeah, going back to what you were saying about costs, costs is another thing, as we were discussing before coming on air, could be one of the factors as to one of the pre-season tests being axed from the calendar next year, Jerez.
Yes, well, it's been a long stay on the pre-season as the curtain raiser has been in many previous years, but it seems that the 3 tests has become 2 from next season, namely in the matter of cost, but there has been also complaints from several outfits that Jerez is not relevant to F1, being a track which isn't on the calendar, hasn't been since 1997, so it now appears that both tests will take place at the Barcelona circuit, Catalonia, and indeed they will not commence until the 1st of March, that they're saying at the moment. So it's going to be almost a month later than we've been used to, and this is in line with the so-called condensed calendar which is being proposed from next season. We'll see what, obviously, Melbourne having that season opener the first weekend of April.
Indeed, and going on to what we saw in Austria last week as well with the testing, you were saying before, what is the relevance of in-season testing? Would you care to elaborate on that a little bit for us?
It's a bit of a hard one to really weigh up. Obviously, it doesn't get the coverage in any quantity near the Formula One races themselves. Obviously, for these younger drivers, it's an invaluable learning curve, and for those cash-strapped outfits there that really need and rely on the dollars, it's got its incentives. But beyond that, and testing these funky rakes and whatnot that you do see appear on several cars, it is questionable whether there's any real necessity to retain this. I don't know what your views are, but I didn't really take too much away from it.
Well, especially for for McLaren at the moment with Honda, Fernando Alonso felt pretty positive on the second day of testing, which was uninterrupted by weather. First day was had a bit of weather about, but second day was pretty good, and Alonso was able to complete more than 100 laps, something that he hasn't been able to do during the regular season so far. But and he really enjoyed getting out there and clocking up the miles for it. But yeah, for other teams like Mercedes or Ferrari, for example, if they don't really have the need for testing, perhaps there's no need there. But again, for someone like McLaren or Red Bull, even with Renault, testing is still important. They can afford to do testing, which is something that the little teams such as Sauber and whatnot, Manor, Marussia, for example, they weren't even,
am I correct in saying?
Manor, Marussia weren't even present because they can't afford to come to the tests. So.
Yeah, well, it really does highlight the stark differences when you have these more optional events, but you can see at the same time that clearly it does have its benefits. So I don't know whether it comes to a point where it becomes more of a privatized session, where it just becomes for those younger drivers per se, for them to get behind the wheel and give these teams which need the capital that avenue. It could be something that's looked at in the future.
Yeah, looking at some of the guys like Pascal Wehrlein for obviously on day one it was for Mercedes, and then for Force India day two. Even this was quite strange to see, DTM champion Marco Wittmann driving a Toro Rosso, and he did pretty well.
Names, don't we? Pascal Wehrlein and Marco Wittmann. Could just say them all.
Yes. And he did quite well as well in the Toro Rosso, fourth fastest on the day, and clocked up the most laps as well, so 158 laps for him. Good on that. But some other names, like Pierre Gasly, who's in GP2 at the moment, Stoffel Van Dorn, GP2 at the moment, guys like them getting mileage in the car, Esteban Ocon. And Ferrari debuted a new guy, Antonio Fuoco, as well.
Yes, he had a bit of an off on the first day, I believe, but he seemed to turn it around a bit better often after that. Clearly, these things are going to happen in the test. It's good to see that it's happening there rather than perhaps being, say, a third reserve driver on a Friday of a Grand Prix meeting and compromising the hopes of a regular driver, as, say, someone along the lines of Romain Grosjean has been experiencing this season with Jolyon Palmer taking his ride for the majority of the first practice sessions.
Indeed, and conclusions basically from the test were that Mercedes are still quick, Ferrari are the number two guys, but Red Bull, they had an interesting on day two. Their car looked more like a shopping trolley. Daniel Ricciardo remarked.
Yeah, it's you could say Freddy Krueger aspects.
Mm.
But what can you do, I guess? It's clearly something that they're desperate to find those extra, not even tenths of a second, hundredths, just something to propel them forward a little bit and get them that extra traction they need to retain, as it is with Force India, as we alluded to earlier, wanting to hunt down that fourth place. They're quite obviously, with Renault now making these inroads that they've promised, they're clearly going to be in it until the end of the season, but whether it does pay off long term, and obviously if that doesn't in the next couple of races, what are we going to hear from Red Bull? Because as we've seen to date, one bad race, and they're very quick on the gun to come out and make these threats that they're going to pull out.
Yeah, the public criticism, but nevertheless, Dan Ricciardo was feeling optimistic. Feels optimistic about coming to Silverstone. He may not get the podium he did last season, but if he's optimistic about where the car's headed for this race, then surely it must be a positive for that outfit.
Well, it must be also said that there's only one more, as a result of Germany, there's this coming race at Silverstone, but the following race at Hungary, that does seem like it's going to be one that might be more of a strong suit for Red Bull. So if they can work on some upgrades, they could go there and be hopeful of maybe getting back into that top 5 standing that weekend.
Indeed, and so moving it on now, obviously we talked about John Todt earlier, the president of the FIA, and he very rarely comes out and talks about F1 and the state of F1, but he did last week talk to a couple of publications, and he basically said, and I quote, that F1 has a headache, not a cancer. And
very provocative, those lines. You must say you don't hear those draconian phrases very often these days. So clearly he's got a bit of a motive there to push things along and obviously change this perception that he is a recluse, in the sense of when we saw Max Mosley, F1 was very much his plaything, and whereas with John Todt it seems as though road safety has been his primary remit.
Yeah, he doesn't he doesn't speak a lot about F1 in public at all, which, a lot of people have criticised. That's another criticism towards the FIA, that they don't do enough for the sport, and it was interesting to hear what John had to say about that, and he said, if you want your sport, if you want the sport to be sorted out, if you want all these problems fixed, give me full control, which, at the moment, there are, CVC and FOM, the commercial partners, have that control as well. That's, they dictate things that happen and whatnot, and in conjunction with the FIA. But what Jean is saying is give him full control, and he will make changes.
So long as we don't get back to the days of Jean-Marie Ballester and we have the old quote, democratic vote, my decision is the best decision.
Yeah, but you don't want it to be a regime either, basically, what you're alluding to there, Ballester, when he was in control. It was more like a regime.
Yeah, who can forget in that wonderful Senna film, the bombastic figure that was Ballester stamping his index finger into the ground and pretty much telling everyone how it was going to be with no objections to be considered.
No communism whatsoever.
Yeah, he was a character, all right.
But yes, interesting of Jean to come out and say that, and this is just basically in response to the mass criticisms that the sport has been receiving, that it's going to crash and burn, and
well, what
it's
dying. Whitmarsh came out with a pretty much a quote to that effect.
Martin Whitmarsh, yeah, former team principal Martin Whitmarsh for McLaren, he said F1 will crash and burn before it becoming great again, and perhaps is that what it needs to go through this difficult period and then come out rosy at the other side? Not sure.
Like a phoenix rising from the ashes. Who knows? F1, it's had its moments in the past, and they've come through with flying colours. So surely things will come to a head sooner than later, where they get back on that right trajectory and make the improvements to return F1 to those days where it is seen as the unequivocal pioneer of motorsport.
Indeed, and just with the amount of competition they have these days in the form of other series, even though it's very difficult to compare them in terms of what can you say? Just in terms of the type of the class of racing that it is, viewership. It doesn't matter. Viewers are going to either see one or the other.
It's always going to be that variation. At the end of the day, you'd hope though the fair weather fans that seem to come out of the woodwork every time there's a race where there's not a million overtakes and whatnot, the truly dramatic events where everyone's got their hearts in their mouths, the ones that endure, they're really the core base, regardless, through these little troughs, as we've emphasised in previous podcasts.
Indeed, but the sport also has to look at how's it going to attract new viewers, and reading about how Formula E and the World Endurance Championship open up their gates. They're a lot more accessible. It's a lot more cheaper in terms of ticket prices and activities on site as well. That's these things are. It doesn't. It may not be the undoing of Formula One, but it certainly puts it in a bad way if it doesn't look to respond to these sort of things.
Well, you could hope that it's an impetus, if anything, to F1 to just remind them to keep themselves on their toes. Obviously, we've seen as well Renault's committed to becoming a Formula E constructor from the next season. Whether this forces Formula One to really compel themselves to retain Renault, or whether they're just happy to let them ride off into the sunset. But you would hope that these are the kind of trigger points which just wakes them up, that they do need to keep at it.
Indeed. So enough about politics and whatnot. We'll talk about Mark Webber, former Aussie driver, of course, for Red Bull Racing.
Yes, you beauty, yes! Who can forget that epic afternoon, 2009, at the Nürburgring?
His Mark Webber's first Grand Prix victory after how many starts was it? It was quite a few.
I believe.
Quite a few. It took him long enough as well, but Mark Webber was the subject of an episode of this program, Australian Story, for those who know, airs on the ABC, looking at the lives of extraordinary Australians, whether it's just ordinary people or sports people, politicians, the whole lot, and basically it recounted his story of how he went off to Europe as a youngster pursuing a career in Formula One, and how he eventually got there. So,
well, it was interesting as well. Obviously, it was an intriguing story. Having followed his career closely, can look back now, and he's a very candid man, old Mark. He says it how it is. He's not afraid to pull those punches, and he's got this autobiography which is going to come out in conjunction with his story in the coming weeks, which will expand on his sentiments from the program. But I think it was poignant what you had to say. You had your own views that you're going to express in an upcoming piece regarding this notion of what happened with Webber towards the end of his career. We're all aware of. He had his skirmishes with Sebastian Vettel, but it seems as though in these recent months he's been able to break bread with the German, and they seem to get along now quite solidly, considering what did transpire in those days as teammates at Red Bull.
Yeah, indeed. I was just having a look at a few quotes that Webber made towards the end of the program regarding Sebastian Vettel, and obviously Multi-21 was the breaking point in that relationship. 2013 Malaysian Grand Prix, where Vettel blatantly defied team orders to take the win away from Webber, and how that pretty much precipitated Webber's decision to call it quits, hang up the boots, as it were, on his career in F1. And yeah, just looking back at that, and how does a relationship recover from that? Something that bad, at the point where I think Webber said that at that point they couldn't stand the sight of each other either.
Yeah, it's strong.
How do they recover? And
when you look, like Vettel was obviously he said he was sincerely sorry following that Malaysian Grand Prix, but Mark did allude that some things went down between there and their supposed catch up at the following Chinese Grand Prix, and they ended up coming away from that meeting at China really even more strained than they had been following the fallout immediately after Malaysia.
Exactly, and this is something that Webber makes no secret of. He thought that there was a secret agenda, as they were, going on at Red Bull Racing, where his teammate was pretty much favoured when it came to any sort of when it came to any sort of dispute or decision inside the camp. So that's that. But yeah, going on, moving on. It's been 2 years, obviously, since Multi 21, and the fact that both of them are talking to each other, and once you take away that professional relationship, obviously they're not teammates anymore. Webber's in Porsche, the World Endurance Championship. Sebastian Vettel's still in F1 with Ferrari. When you take away that relationship there, it allows you to go and make up a new one, and obviously both can move on. That's what Webber has said, that time will heal wounds, and they've moved on from that and looking at a new start.
Well, hats off to both of them. They're clearly pure-born racers, and to be able to actually get to the point now where they've accepted they've clearly still got their differences of opinion, but they've been able to come to a compromise and say, yeah, well, that was racing, and now they can have these civil relations. It's a nice sign. Obviously, when you see through the years, there's been many infamous rifts like we've seen with Senna and Prost, and obviously that never got to be realised, because we did see that those two had reconciled to a degree until that fateful afternoon in '94. So it's nice that Webber and Vettel have had the opportunity now to actually come to this point where they can be in each other's presence.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, you talk about Prost and Senna as well, and what a lot of people don't or don't have the knowledge of is the fact that after Prost's retirement from the sport, from when he retired from Williams, both became in close contact with each other, and were quite close. Yeah, obviously leading up to that point in '94, and it just, when you take away that dimension of that element of competition, when you just pull all the layers back, just to be normal human beings, it does really show different character almost. Senna obviously was quite ruthless on track, and Prost, the professor, calculative and all that. But when you peel back the layers and just put them in a room together as two normal human beings, the rapport is different.
Oh, absolutely. On the racetrack, they're considered supermen, but they're just like you and I. They're like everyone. They're just mere humans, and it's good to see that they can remember that at the end of the day, that was just their profession, their career, and that's had a time and place. So now, yeah, they're expecting that, and hopefully this will be the case in any future skirmishes which might eventuate in F1. Obviously, Hamilton and Rosberg, they were close friends back in the karting pre-F1 days, and right now they're frosty at best. They're what you could call friendship, but hopefully when they've hung up their helmets down the track, they can get back to some semblance of how things were.
Indeed, and I'll be sure to pop a link in the description to this article that I'll be posting onto my own blog regarding forgiveness and human nature, and obviously the story about Mark Webber and Sebastian Vettel. But it's time to take a trip down the nostalgia straight. This week, last week we took a look at the Valencia Grand Prix. This week we're going back quite a bit to 1992 and a British hero, Baden. Who might that be?
Yes, we all know that the man with the tash, the red 5, Nigel Mansell. Indeed, this was the year where the reckoning came to the man who had so much suffering pretty much up to that point. He had so many near misses and
so many hardships.
Yeah, I couldn't resist that little phrase, but that is the way you have to perceive with Mansell. He had so many of these little flashpoints where things went wrong for him that you couldn't really make up in any other context. I mean, he had his 86 moment for one at Adelaide when that tyre exploded on him when he was on track potentially to claim that title. And I was indeed researching earlier. He reckons had he impacted the wall, there would have been a red flag that would have been deployed at that stage, and the race would have been cancelled from that point. And according to that, he would have been declared with enough points, regardless of where he had come, to be declared the champion that year. So that adds a bit of context to that moment, which I wasn't aware of until recently. Then he had 87 Suzuka. He had a massive impact with the tyre bundle. He had severe compression in his spine, and Nige being Nige. That was a pretty painful moment for him, I'm sure. And of course, more comically, 91 at Canada. Who can forget when he doffed his so-called cap in the car when he waved to the fans, saying thank you for coming out and supporting me. He dropped the car's revs so low that the engine actually cut out and he couldn't even cross the finish line, and he lost his victory there. Only Nige could suffer that, could he?
So many interesting moments, but in particular, looking at his 1992 season and this being the week of the British Grand Prix, his victory at the British Grand Prix was one of many outstanding displays that season from Red 5.
Oh, absolutely. That year was really unprecedented. Williams that year, they pioneered the kind of technology which these days is commonplace. We're seeing almost every other event there's some innovation, but back those days it was very much, I wouldn't say purer, but it was just very much basic innovations. And then for 92 we had this advent of active suspension, which changed the game entirely. There was a lot of complaints naturally from their opponents that it was going too far, that it was extreme. We saw it in Senna as well, saying how desperate he was to get behind the wheel of one of these Adrian Newey creations. But as it was, Nigel took full advantage of it. 92, he was really just claiming every race before him. Culminated in that elusive title, but specifically this British Grand Prix in front of his home crowd. He put on a show and won it quite convincingly with his teammate Patrese in second. And indeed, as you were mentioning, Martin Brundle got his delighted the home fans with a third place.
Yeah, that was his second podium in Formula One. His first one came at the race beforehand. But yeah, Brundle, second podium, career podium for him, and first one for him at home, so good for him then. But yeah, going back to Nige, 9 wins out of 16 races, it's a pretty dominant effort, and perhaps, something similar to Lewis Hamilton's effort last season in the Mercedes.
Absolutely. You wouldn't say on the statistical scale, but obviously Mercedes won 16 out of 19 overall. But at the time, Nigel's 9 victories in a campaign, that was the record until Schumacher equalled it, first of all, 95. Then we all know what he did in the early 2000s. He pretty much just annulled that entire single-digit being respectable victory notion. But for the time, for 92, they were really, Williams, as I said, they just changed the entire outlook of F1 in terms of what it meant to be a dominant force. We did see McLaren, obviously, in 88. They won 15 out of 16, but between then and 92, there was a lot more even spread. Williams came in with these innovations, and Nige, he really, he got his just reward for what he had endured up to that point.
Indeed, and again, that's as we keep talking almost every week about the cyclical nature of Formula One. The 90s really was, a period of Williams domination.
Yeah, well, the 90s, pretty much, it was bookended by McLaren, you could say. 90, 91 was McLaren with Williams chomping at the bit, and obviously those innovations came to the fore in time for 92, 93, and into speed there with Schumacher, doing some quite superhuman efforts there. But you could say the whole 90s there, Williams really did have the best chassis, which we saw with Senna when he went to 94 with Williams, and obviously he couldn't live out any kind of hopes of getting back to being the number one. But again, with JV 97, Damon Hill in 96, it was their decade for Williams, and for McLaren it was very much a British dominated decade.
Yeah, indeed. McLaren switching over to Ford and then to Peugeot before eventually that changed.
At this moment, couldn't you?
Sorry?
You could almost say that the Peugeot experience was up there as being as ill-fated as the Honda one is at this stage.
Oh, there's still plenty of days to see out the Honda experience, but again, it's all very complicated, and but I'm sure Honda will come right. Peugeot, had their problems and didn't want to stick around. Then Mercedes came along.
Yeah, we know what happened there. They were bulletproof for a while, but then they had their eventual issues too, and now it's culminated in what, 20 years. They're onto Honda, and hopefully reliving those epic memories from the late 80s, early 90s with Senna at the wheel. But also on that Senna notion, we need to get back to that British Grand Prix in '92. There was a very poignant moment between Noige and Ayrton Senna that really is timeless.
Yeah, the Senna obviously retired from the race just before, a few laps before the end, and who better to get a lift back to the pits than with the race winner, Nige himself. So very good images from that, seeing Senna mounted on the Williams chassis whilst Nigel's driving back to the pits. It's a scene that we've seen repeated a couple of times between Fernando Alonso and Mark Webber.
Well, who can forget that one in it was Webber's final season in 2013 when we didn't realise at the time quite that he was almost close to being minced meat just before he could make that switch to Porsche. I think it was Nico Rosberg nearly swept him up coming around that corner as he got onto the rear of Alonso's car as the Spaniard reciprocated for what Webber did for him at the, I believe it was the Nürburgring event, maybe 2011.
Grand Prix in 2011, and what happened in 2013, that was at Singapore, I recall.
Yeah, and Webber actually got a hefty sanction as a result of that. Still, activity for what it is, it's great sportsmanship, and the site, it's something that's beyond any kind of reproach and punishment which may result from it.
Indeed, and both guys, Fernando and Mark, they were quite good friends. It was obvious to see that friendship there between the two. So,
oh, absolutely, it's good to see as well, just in that aspect of camaraderie that these drivers can have that outside the cockpit, just that relationship, which is very rare these days indeed. It's so ruthless that everyone's just in it for themselves. So it'd be nice to see these kind of images again in F1 in the future, but that's probably wishful thinking.
Indeed, obviously it is nice to see that, a bit of personality from the drivers in the paddock, except, instead of seeing, PR figures and whatnot. But, yeah, as you say, it's wishful thinking. And I guess on that note, we can wrap it up for this for now.
I think we'll have a lot more on Sunday, but for now, at least we've got Britain to look forward to, the practice and the qualifying, and yeah, we'll discuss a lot more and possibly emphasise on what we've discussed this evening.
Yeah, well, obviously we'll be back on Sunday pre-race. We'll take a look at qualifying for you and give our tips for the race. So until then, from me, Jawad, and Baden, that's a wrap. Thank you very much for joining us, and see you next time.
Good night.